All right, so we left off at the end of last class. We had moved into the Four Noble Truths, and we had essentially covered the first noble truth, uh, true suffering. And again, we said that one effective way of thinking about the phrasing is to use this idea of true suffering rather than the truth of, because it helps us to spotlight the difference between what ordinary sentient beings think about suffering and what um, not necessarily enlightened beings, but at least Arya beings, because that's actually um, the word noble in the Four Noble Truths is referring to not nobility in the English sense of the word, but it's referring to Arya. So it's really another way of saying Four Noble Truths is the four things that are known to be true by those who are not ordinary sentient beings like ourselves, but are Arya beings. And an Arya being is not an enlightened being necessarily, but a practitioner who has developed their mind to the point where they have had what is called a direct realization of the nature of reality. Uh, so, for that kind of person, the world looks very different. Their understanding of the world is very different than when we look at the world. Like we said, we as ordinary sentient beings, we have some understanding of suffering, but it is not as nuanced, it is not as profound, it is not as all encompassing or accurate as it is for an Arya being, for a person who's been able to develop themselves to the point of having this direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. And that as a concept will become more clear, but probably not until the fifth class. It takes most of the time of the fifth class, has to be devoted to kind of making sense of that. It's there's a lot to discuss with that. So this is something that we did cover last week, the three divisions of the first noble truth, true suffering. And then we have true causation. So, we talked, I think we began to touch a little bit on true causation. So, one way of thinking of the Four Noble Truths is to, one analogy that's used is the analogy of like a medical model. So, with the first noble truth, which we said is kind of a bummer, right? Because it's all about deeply understanding the depth and breadth of unsatisfactory conditions. That, though, from a medical model perspective, is necessary because if something is wrong, if something is a problem, if something needs to be fixed, you do need to understand that issue in a great deal of specificity, a great level, a high level of detail. You would want your personal physician not to have just a passing understanding of your coronary artery disease. You would want them to understand the minutia of what you're going through. And that's what the first noble truth is. It is giving us an exquisite level of detail into our existential condition. Um, and as we progress through the Four Noble Truths, they get more and more hopeful in a way, because now with the second noble truth, true causation, we can understand that the first noble truth isn't causeless. It isn't just something that is without any understanding of its origin or the reason that it is our existential condition. And that's also, if we go back to this idea of a medical model, also necessary, because if you go to your doctor because you're having chest pains and your doctor runs a bunch of tests and they say, on the basis of these tests, I've diagnosed you with, stage 1 of coronary artery disease. Um, you would want them to not say, well, we don't know why people get coronary artery disease. Just kind of happens. It's just a thing that just pops up from time to time. You would want them to say, well, we do have a pretty good understanding of what the causes, these are the things that you maybe have been doing that are contributing to this. And so with that understanding, your physician can begin to guide you out of what is giving rise to that disease. So here, true causation is the three poisons: attachment, anger, and fundamental ignorance. So attachment and anger are kind of two sides of the same coin. Attachment is a mind that exaggerates that which is pleasant and feels like one's happiness is dependent upon being in possession of what seems to be pleasant. And anger is what happens in the mind when one is separated from what is pleasant. Um, when attachment isn't able to get what it wants. Attachment is this mind, this greedy mind that only wants to bring in what is pleasant when unavoidably we are in contact with what is unpleasant or we are separated from what is pleasant, then anger arises in the mind. Kind of a sense of aversion arises in the mind. And fundamental ignorance is a much more complicated concept, and it's related to what we have been talking about before, the insight into the nature of reality. And so we will unpack some understanding of fundamental ignorance, but probably not right now. It's going to, again, we need to give that its own time in order to make sense of it. But essentially what we can say is that anger and attachment are both exaggerated states of mind, and they result from fundamental ignorance, which is a mind that doesn't understand the nature of things. We talked about having a direct insight. Fundamental ignorance is just what is present for us, not yet having had that fundamental insight into the nature of reality. Okay, so now with true cessation, things are getting even better from this idea of a medical perspective, diagnosing and then doing something about our existential condition of true suffering. Because, again, if we think of the Buddha here as this physician who is diagnosing the existential condition of true suffering, now he's saying, not only do I know why you are suffering, what is the origin of your suffering, but I know that this cause is fully removable, is fully, you know, um, removable from the mind. The cause of the three poisons, attachment, ignorance, and anger, that is not a baked in aspect of the mind. It is, in Buddhism, they've decided to call it adventitious, which means it is arising in the mind. It does characterize our present experience as an ordinary sentient being, not yet having had this direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality, but it isn't, we're not stuck in it, forever and ever and ever. There is a possibility of pursuing a cessation of these causes. And that is what Buddhism is all about, is pursuing these causes of true cessations. And the Buddha taught two pathways. to a true cessation, meaning a cessation that is irrevocable, a cessation that isn't lost. So one path of training is, you could say, either lower nirvana. Some people, the word nirvana is often associated with the Theravadan tradition, but you could also think of in terms of lower nirvana or higher nirvana. That's one way of translating, or nirvana and then full enlightenment, different ways of kind of thinking about these two paths. So lower nirvana is the path of training that is the stated goal of, as I mentioned, the Theravadan tradition, which is common in Southeast Asia. And in full enlightenment is the path of training that the Buddha taught, or is the culmination of the path of training that the Buddha taught, that is the stated goal in what's called the Mahayana tradition, which is what the Tibetan tradition is a part of. So the Buddha taught both of these goals. He taught the Theravadan tradition, or what became the Theravadan tradition, emphasizes the goal of individual enlightenment or lower nirvana, and the Mahayana tradition, which is what Tibetan Buddhism is a part of, emphasizes the goal of full enlightenment. And both of these are true cessations, meaning that for oneself, um, all of the delusions, the afflictions, are fully removed from the mind. So one achieves one's own highest welfare through either of these true cessations. Um, and then there are these are called the three higher trainings, which are the true paths that lead to the cessation of suffering. So you have the training in ethics, the training in concentration, and the training in wisdom. These are the mechanisms that the Buddha gave, the tools that the Buddha gave that can be pursued in slightly different ways that can result either in individual enlightenment or full enlightenment, depending on the Theravadan tradition or the Mahayana tradition. Okay, so that is yeah, that's a little bit of an overview of the Four Noble Truths, the four things that are known to be true by the Aryas, those who are more advanced than we are and who see the world differently than we do. Um, yeah. Any questions about the Four Noble Truths? Yes.
Venerable, what's the difference between nirvana and enlightenment?
So, for a person who's in the Theravadan tradition, which again is common in Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, um, they pursue what you could call individual enlightenment or lower nirvana. So when that is accomplished, when that is achieved in the mind of that particular practitioner, their mind is able to um, achieve a state that is irrevocable, meaning they don't fall back into ordinary experience like we're having, but it is not as complete of a realization as is possible to have. Um, that practitioner has removed all of the afflictive states of mind. They no longer experience any kind of suffering. And that's a permanent state for them. They can abide like that. Their mind separates at death and just abides as mind, free from any afflictive state, and those afflictive states, as we saw, are the source of suffering. Suffering doesn't come from what's happening in the environment, it comes from the content of our mind. So when you are free of afflictive states of mind, then you are free from suffering. It is possible, though, to go further in your training, and remove not only what I mentioned, the afflictive states, but to remove what are called the subtle obscurations to knowledge or the obscurations to omniscience. Those are different translations of Tibetan. Um, and that is the techniques for doing that, the methods for doing that are contained in the Mahayana tradition. And what that allows for that practitioner to do is to not only be free of the afflicted states, but to use this period of their existence, um, where mind is abiding as mind in a more purified state, to use that period of their existence to intentionally take rebirth, to manifest that consciousness back into the places where ordinary sentient beings are existing, in order to take advantage of the fact that they themselves have this perfected mind. And because they've removed the subtle obscurations to knowledge or to omniscience, not only does that unlock the ability to intentionally manifest into, back into cyclic existence, but it makes them, the perfect kind of guide for ordinary sentient beings, to give ordinary sentient beings not just like general guidance about like, well, you could do this, or generally this is a good idea, but for each individual person, because they can see all of the karmic causes and conditions that are part of that individual person's unique mind stream. Their advice is perfect. Their advice, their guidance is flawless. Now, that's an ordinary sentient being may not follow that guidance. They may not, they may not be in a position to actually follow through. That's up to the individual. The Buddha can't, those kinds of Buddhas, enlightened beings, they can't just force, people to do what they've advised. But that is why, in the Mahayana tradition, a practitioner would be encouraged to take that extra step and to engage in those methods, because you can then really be of benefit to ordinary sentient beings, much more so than just abiding separately from cyclic existence and not being able to re-enter, voluntarily, willingly, on the basis of love and compassion for sentient beings, not being able to manifest in the places where those ordinary sentient beings are. So, really, either way, they're, as I mentioned, they're both true cessations. The individual no longer suffers, but it is of greater benefit to the ordinary sentient beings, um, if you can achieve that state where you've gone a bit further in your training and not only removed the afflictive emotions, but also removed those subtle obscurations to knowledge. And those methods just, they're just not part of the Theravadan canon of teachings. They're just not included in what's called the Pali. There's the Pali canon and the Sanskrit canon, um, which are two different languages that ultimately the Buddhist teachings got memorialized into. And those methods kind of made it into the Sanskrit canon, and are just not present in the Pali canon.
Thank you, Venerable.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we will switch gears a little bit after the Four Noble Truths, and we'll talk about, we'll give a little bit of an overview, a presentation of mind in Tibetan Buddhism, the Tibetan Buddhist understanding of the model of the mind. So, mind in Tibetan Buddhism, its most fundamental definition is here on the screen: that which is clear and knowing, or that which possesses clarity and awareness. And so, this is the fundamental definition of what a mind, a consciousness is at its root. So, clear and knowing, or clarity and awareness, basically refers to the fact or the aspect of the mind as a non-physical energy that is able to generate an internal representation of that which it's directed toward. And as an ordinary sentient being, as I mentioned, we, not having any kind of realization of the nature of reality, we are dealing with both the afflictive obscurations and the obscurations to knowledge or to omniscience. And that's so those obstacles, those obscurations are present in our minds. They are co-arising with mind for in our subjective experience. So for us, this process of directing our minds toward objects and generating an internal representation of those objects necessarily involves some distortion, because it's almost like the mind itself isn't a problem, right? The mind at its most basic is the mind of a Buddha, is the mind of a fully awakened being. We don't like generate some kind of brand new mind. What we really do is remove the obscurations to knowledge, and we remove the afflictive obscurations. But because we haven't removed them, the mind is kind of covered by both of those sets or layers of problematic states. And so that introduces a distortion in our experience that would be absent or is absent once those obscurations are, through training, removed from the mind. So, why this keeps, I probably do know why. My mouse is giving me trouble. Okay, so when we say mind, what Buddhism separates mind into 6 kinds of mind. So we have here the 5 bodily sense consciousnesses, and then we have the mental sense consciousness. So the taste sense consciousness is being directed toward objects of taste, right? We're eating something, putting something in the mouth, and then we're getting some internal representation of bitter, of sweet, of sour, of, whatever it might be, flavor, different aspects of flavor. The tactile sense is again being directed toward physical objects in the environment, and it is generating an internal representation of hot, cold, rough, smooth, sharp, dull, things of that sort, bumpy, all kinds of tactile sensations, pressure, that sort of thing. The eye consciousness is being directed toward visual form. The auditory consciousness is being directed toward sounds. The olfactory, the nose, is being directed towards smells, right? And so we're getting information from our environment from all of these 5 bodily sense consciousnesses. And then you have the mental sense consciousness, which is layering on top of all of that raw sensory data, right? So we taste something, and the taste sense consciousness is detecting some combination, as I mentioned, of bitter, of sour, of sweet, etc. The mental sense consciousness then comes along and says that's pleasant or that's unpleasant, or I could take it or leave it, like a cracker, like a just a plain white, like, oh, that's kind of neutral, or not. uh, if I'm starving, maybe I'll eat it, but I'm not going to be thinking about it. um, and the same is true of all of these. Everything, all of the data that we get from taste, from touch, from sight, from hearing, from smell, it's all being judged by the mental sense consciousness and being categorized as pleasant or unpleasant, or kind of just neutral, kind of just blah, kind of not particularly impactful. Um, and so, one problem that arises, and one reason why it's really important to understand these divisions of the mind, is because this process, these two things are happening extremely quickly. The eye consciousness is seeing a visual form, and then the mental consciousness is judging that visual form as pleasant or unpleasant or neutral in the next millisecond. And that gives rise to us to a confusion where we think that we are seeing that which is pleasant or that which is unpleasant. We are tasting that which is pleasant, that which is unpleasant. And we don't really recognize that our own mental sense consciousness is making that judgment, is making that determination based on a whole range of past history, cultural, experiences, what we were fed as a child, what is happening in our society, what sort of social norms are existing. Dozens of different, you could say, filters are present in our mental sense consciousness and are kind of actively creating our subjective experience. But we mistake that for the kind of more immediate experience of the sight, the smell, the taste, etc. So that gives rise to a confusion, which is critical in Buddhism, a confusion of not taking responsibility for the active nature of how our mind is generating our experience, and instead just thinking that we're just noticing what is out there. We're noticing that which is true, um, which is not, from the Buddhist perspective, not at all what's happening. And that becomes, critically important as we progress, as we understand, like what is it that we're really encouraged to be doing with all of this. Okay. So the basis of a mental event, then, a mental event is a cognition, a perception, um, is one or more of these six sense consciousnesses, the five bodily sense consciousnesses and the mental sense consciousness, and then an object that consciousness is being directed toward, and then a prior moment in the continuity of that consciousness. So, if your eyes are closed, right, you have to open your eyes, and then there's a millisecond or something, a nanosecond, whatever it might be, where light rays, photons, have to hit your eye consciousness, your eyeball, before the visual form can be dawning in your eye sense consciousness, for example. So you need this prior moment in the continuity. It kind of has to be active. That channel has to be active in order to get that data. It's a technical point that maybe isn't so important, but um, so any kind of thought or feeling or emotion or perception, so that you could say that there are cognitions and perceptions. Perceptions are more sensory and cognitions are more mental. They all involve, as I say, one or more, because you may have raw sensory data and then you may have a mental you may have the mental sense consciousness making a judgment about the raw sensory data. Or you could certainly have a daydream or a memory or a plan, something that's only happening really in the mental sense consciousness. So it doesn't have to be, more than one, but it has to at least be one of these um, sense consciousnesses are active and receiving information, and then they're always engaged in some object, either a purely mental object or an object that one of the bodily sense consciousnesses is interacting with. So the mind then is, from the Buddhist perspective, asserted to be a beginningless and endless continuity of those mental events, those individual moments where one or more of the six consciousnesses are perceiving, are apprehending an object of bodily, an object of the bodily sense consciousnesses or an object of the mental sense consciousness. That is what mind is. It is a river of mental events, or a stream, or there's different analogies of a continuity. So one mental event after the other, that has no beginning and no end. Um, and they say it's beginningless because there are sutras where the Buddha, the historical Buddha, said, I looked for a beginning and I couldn't find one. So, at least we know that, and, as I mentioned, a fully enlightened Buddha is someone who's um, removed the obscurations to omniscience. So we can at least say that Buddhas, when they look, they go back and back and back, and they can't find any beginning of the mind. And also, there is no force that opposes mind. There is no way for mind to cease. Mind can change in terms of what its characteristics are. It can move from a mind that is characterized by the afflictive obscurations and the obscurations to knowledge into a mind that is not characterized by the afflictive obscurations or the obscurations to knowledge, which is the process of mind moving from being ordinary to being enlightened, fully enlightened in that case. But mind can never be opposed in such a way where it ceases, which is where endless comes from. So the choice from the Buddhist perspective is, do we want to be ordinary forever, or do we want to move into a state of enlightenment, a state where the afflictive obscurations and the obscurations to knowledge are just not part of our experience, and mind is abiding in a perfected state, because we have no choice but to continue having mental events, continue having, a mind that is functioning forever. All right. So that is a brief overview of the Tibetan Buddhist model of the mind. Are there any questions about that? Yes.
So would you say that mind can be characterized as being both permanent and impermanent in nature?
So we will look at that when we get to the four seals, which is what we're about to do. So I'll just what so permanent in Buddhism means something specific. It means unchanging. It doesn't mean eternal. So what the mind is an example of a phenomenon that is impermanent because it is changing moment by moment by moment, but it is eternal. It doesn't have a beginning or an end. So Buddhism, the problem is really it's just semantic in a way, in the sense that Buddhism only uses the English word permanent to mean that which does not change moment by moment by moment. But our minds are definitely changing moment by moment by moment. So they are impermanent. They just are also eternal.
Thank you.
Mary Jo, you had a question?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm wondering about when we're no longer alive in our bodies, our physical bodies, and we're somewhere else, maybe a bardo or something. Is our mind still active then?
So the mind is this continuity of mental events. It The way that it's being expressed does have a intimate relationship to what it's connected to, right? So right now, the mind, this non-physical energy that is beginningless and endless and has as its fundamental nature clarity and awareness, right now it is connected to a human body. And so it is being expressed through the form of a human body. And that impacts in very important ways, like what kind of subjective experience is happening for us presently. I mean, even that can change, though, of course, because a person can, have a stroke. I mean, all kinds of physical things can happen to a human body that a person can lose language, they can lose memory, because the mind and the brain, are deeply interconnected. Buddhism doesn't dispute that they're deeply interconnected, but they do present them as different continua, as different phenomenon that share a deep interconnection. So, as a human, we have access to a particular range of experiences, um, and that implies that not only are we human, but that our brain is kind of working ordinarily, normally, that it's not diseased, it's not injured, because disease and injury will impact how the mind is being expressed. And so when that relationship changes, then absolutely the subjective experience changes. In the intermediate state, the bardo, there are experiences, there is a subjective process that is unfolding, but it wouldn't be exactly the same as it was during your lifetime. It would shift, it would become different, because that mind isn't being expressed through the medium of the physical body anymore. And so, and then of course, when you take rebirth, you'll have a different, I mean, it could be another human form, but it could be some other very different form. And then that will impact what kind of subjective experience is arising because of that relationship between mind and form. But the subjective awareness aspect is always happening, but it's never exact. It does change. And then, of course, even over the course of our lifetime, it's changed, right? We had the subjective experience of a newborn. We had the subjective experience of a 2-year-old. That's quite different than the subjective experience that we're presently having. So it's always changing, but it changes more dramatically, when mind is separate from body or connected to a very different type of body.
Do you think that our animal pets have minds?
Well, of course, yeah, the animal realm is one of the options for mind. So, the mind that is connected to this body has been connected to many animal bodies over, I mean, uh, uh, trillions of animal bodies previously, and that certainly can happen again. There's no reason why we can't go directly from this life to an animal body. There's nothing intrinsic or inherent about mind in terms of human mind. There's no such thing as human mind. There is mind connected to a human body. And because the mind is connected to the human body is able to express that mind in a different way than an animal body is able to express that mind. But it doesn't, the mind itself is the same.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, there's another question.
Yeah, so talking about the aggregates, and our mind making the connection like or dislike, if we can stop that from happening in this life, is that enlightened state of mind?
I would say that when the idea of stopping it, I think, as an idea, is maybe something that can be gotten at in different ways. Not all of them. I think it's possible. I mean, for example, even just a person who has really high states of meditative concentration, they would, when they're experiencing that, their mind is quite different. Their mind is not, attached in this. They've transcended attachment and aversion. Um, you know, that, but then they exit. They come back to that state isn't permanent. They can achieve that, and then they arise for meditation, and then certainly it bleeds over. Certainly they're much much better off than before they could do that, but it's not completely eliminated. So what I would say is that I don't know of a way to accomplish that is irreversible other than enlightenment. I think it's a consequence or a side effect of enlightenment. We can certainly make progress. We can understand, we can become more and more aware of the exaggerations that we're engaging in, and we can apply kind of antidotes to them, and we can make progress in that direction. But we lose, the only thing that's not irreversible is, and of course there's another aspect to that which we'll get into that we haven't addressed really so far, which is that one thing that I mentioned, the methods, right? The methods that are different between those that are able to achieve full enlightenment and those that are able to achieve individual enlightenment. And one part of that is what's called the mind of bodhicitta, the mind that wishes to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. That is a necessary part of what allows a person to ultimately be able to accomplish the state of full enlightenment, as opposed to falling into the path of individual enlightenment. which has really nothing to do with, just having because it's not necessary, right? It's unique to the Mahayana tradition to this idea of full enlightenment. So a person could reach a state of deep equanimity, which is kind of like what you're describing, like a state of like, well, this could happen, that could happen, it's all fine, and have no training in bodhicitta, and therefore would most definitely not be enlightened. And even the realization of bodhicitta is something that a person can lose up until a certain point of training. A realization of bodhicitta is also reversible up to a certain stage of training. So the only way that I could really say is that I think that we can train our minds more and more to be equanimous, to apply antidotes to craving, attachment, aversion, but we'll die, right? We're going, no matter what we do to make progress on those things, they won't really stick in a permanent way until we achieve enlightenment. And so it is a side effect of enlightenment, but there is no way to say that I've made a lot of progress on being, having an equanimous mind, and that is the same as enlightenment. Because again, a person hasn't necessarily removed, also the obscurations to omniscience. I would think very, very clearly that a Theravadan practitioner would be able to get to that state, but they've not removed the obscurations to omniscience.
So would you then say that if we can get to a point where liking and disliking is not strong in our day-to-day life, are we then getting closer to realizing emptiness?
It's certainly really helpful. I think it certainly calms down the mind. But I mean, for example, like the wisdom realizing impermanence, right, would be one technique that would help a person, right? Because you could be like, well, this pleasant thing is changing moment by moment. This unpleasant thing is changing moment by moment. There's really nothing static or permanent, there. So a really deep meditative realization of impermanence could go a long way, maybe, to developing this equanimity. But that person may not have any training in the nature of, the ultimate nature. That sort of the conventional nature of reality is impermanence, but the ultimate nature of reality is emptiness. So I think it's a necessary step in the right direction, but I think it's achievable really in a mind of someone who hasn't studied or understood or is practicing any of the specific trainings that actually give rise to the realization of emptiness.
So the like and the dislike comes from believing in the I, right? It's I like, I don't like.
Well, it's a process of reification. And from the Buddhist perspective, what they would talk about the emptiness of the self and the emptiness of phenomenon. And you can apply the teachings on emptiness to either, and by realizing one, you do realize all. You do, it's the same. So we're not only reifying or concretizing the self. Oh, they left. They dropped out. Wait. So from the Buddhist perspective, when they talk about the process of concretization or reification, they apply it both to the self. They say that the mind is doing that both in connection to the self and in connection to all external phenomenon. And it is ultimately, it's the fact that we are doing it with regard to the self is more important um, but from the Buddhist perspective, we do actually have to apply wisdom, realizing emptiness toward, you know, toward both. Once we have a direct non-conceptual realization of emptiness, it becomes quite easy to understand the emptiness because it's the same. We concretize in the same way with regard to external phenomenon and the self. But we do have to kind of uh, intentionally um, apply wisdom realizing emptiness both toward the process of concretizing the self and the process of concretizing external phenomenon. So because there is this process of I am, I exist in a concretized way, but also I think that you exist in a concretized way and you are not me, right? You are a phenomenon external to me. But every time I cognize you, I also wrongly concretize that process. And every time, I'm not really, I'm apprehending something that is separate from me. So I have to ultimately, I have to come to understand that I don't exist in that mistaken way, but also that things that are outside of myself don't exist. And Buddhism doesn't deny completely that it is true that things are external to oneself, right? There's, because mind streams, for example, are not they're not all the same, right? When I achieve enlightenment, that may happen before or after you achieve enlightenment. This mind stream and that mind stream are not the same. It isn't that there's like one source. Buddhism doesn't have the idea that there's like one source of mind, and we're mistakenly dividing up that one source. Buddhism accepts the idea that individual mind streams are in fact individual, are in fact unique. So they don't completely throw out this idea of things not, but it's just when ordinary mind is taking that to an extreme. Ordinary mind is taking that much further than is valid or is true. So but yeah, I mean, ultimately we do have to realize that we're doing that not only toward oneself but also toward things that are external toward to oneself. So I mean, things really, it isn't true that things don't have any kind of status that is separate from oneself. It's just that we go way too far in thinking about that separate status. Is that sort of clear? Or
yeah, I was just thinking that the liking and the disliking is personal. It's not, something that I like,
mm-hmm,
you might not like, but
mm-hmm.
it's the same.
Right. So that's kind of like all of those filters that I was, saying that are in the mind because of our upbringing, our, different life experiences, are even just different biological. Some people might have more taste receptors for bitter, or for, some people, have the cilantro kind of gene, and cilantro tastes like soap. Or if somebody's colorblind, right, they're going to have a different subjective experience than someone who's not colorblind. So yeah, there's all kinds of reasons why we come to different conclusions about. But everyone, when you dislike something and I like it, the object that we are relating to, you could say it's chocolate cake, right? I like chocolate cake. Maybe you hate chocolate cake. We would all agree that it's chocolate cake and not, Brussels sprouts. We all conventionally would all give it the same name, but you're convinced that it is disgusting from its own side, and I'm convinced that it is delicious from its own side. So it's that process of concretization that we're both doing. We're just filtering the information in different ways that are leading us down different paths to, different conclusions are arising on the basis of our own uniqueness, our own, the filters that are unique to you and I.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So the four seals, so here, the four seals are four things that are true about the Buddhist teachings. That any Buddhist teaching would have to be in accordance or in agreement with these four ideas. If any particular philosophy or teaching violates one of the four seals, then that just means it's not a Buddhist teaching. Okay, so the first seal, all compounded phenomena are impermanent, which is getting back to what kind of has already come up about the nature of the mind. So we need to define compounded phenomena and impermanent. So a compounded phenomena is anything that exists as a product composed of other things. So from our, in terms of our world, anything that you can taste or touch or see or, interact with is a compounded phenomena. It's composed of other things. There are atoms or minerals or molecules. It's come together through a combination of more than one factor as a compounded phenomenon. And yeah, so, and then impermanent means that all anything that is like that, anything that exists as a product, is changing moment by moment by moment, and is therefore impermanent. The second seal, all contaminated things are unsatisfactory. So a contaminated thing is anything that has past karma and delusion as its origin. So here we can just say contaminated thing is sort of a loaded term in my mind. It just means ordinary. We can just think of it as an ordinary thing. Our body is an ordinary thing. Our mind is an ordinary thing. Our world is ordinary, which means that its present manifestation is the result of past karma and delusion. If we didn't have any past karma and delusion in our mind, then we'd be enlightened. We wouldn't have an ordinary body that is subject to sickness and aging and death and so on. And we wouldn't exist in this world, due to the force of having been born here under karma and affliction or delusion. We would be abiding in what's called a pure realm, the environment of a Buddha. So because we're ordinary, we can say that past karma and delusion are the reason that we are currently having this ordinary experience, and everything in our environment is a product of this combination of ordinary minds that are inhabiting this world, this place. And then the third seal, all phenomena are selfless. And again, here, this is something that we'll come back to in the last class so that we can really kind of unpack it. So we'll, in a way, sort of skip it. But again, we've been touching on it a little bit here and there. If a person were to say that something had a real findable essence from its own side, from the side of the object, then that would violate this third seal. If, for example, the Christian conception of a soul is something that is, from that perspective, from that philosophical or religious perspective, it's considered to be, something that's really the real essence of a person is their soul. Buddhism disputes the idea that we have this real, unchanging, findable essence. So that distinguishes a Buddhist philosophy from a non-Buddhist philosophy. And then the fourth seal, nirvana, is peace. So, and again, could be lower nirvana and higher nirvana, either of these paths of training that the Buddha taught. They are both, as we've said, they're both true cessations. And therefore, because the afflictions are not able to arise in that person's mind, then they are abiding in a state of true peace, perfect peace, peace that is permanent, that you can't fall back from that state of peace. Yeah. So, and again, because this characterizes all Buddhist teachings, then, it applies to both lower nirvana and higher nirvana, even though there's an additional aspect to full enlightenment that isn't really captured here because those methods are not contained in the Theravadan tradition. It doesn't really qualify as like a seal, for all Buddhist teachings to address that kind of further step of being able to manifest into back into cyclic existence, back into these ordinary places where sentient beings are abiding. It's sort of limited to this idea of the true cessation of suffering, which are applicable to both forms of nirvana. Okay, I know that I kind of went through the four seals a bit quickly. Are there any questions about the four seals? Again, these are four ways of like sealing, validating the teachings. It's important for us to know, do anything, if we're being told something that is Buddhist, does it abide by the four seals? Is it harmonious with these four seals, or does it seem to violate them? In which case we should reject it as a Buddhist teaching. It could be a perfectly, useful idea, but we would have to say it's non-Buddhist. No. Okay, so we then will move in a slightly different direction. This section, yes, Mary Jo. Did you have a question, or are you trying to unmute? You're still muted if you're trying to unmute.
Are those, is it just Mahayana Buddhism?
No, any Buddhist teaching, whether it's Theravadan or Mahayana, or any Buddhist teaching has to comport with all four seals. In order for it to be a valid teaching of the historical Buddha.
Thank you.
Okay, so this section is kind of, there was a slide, it said what it means to be a Buddhist. So in one way, a Buddhist is someone who abides by the four seals. And in another way, a Buddhist is someone who abides by the five lay precepts. There is a ceremony called going for refuge, the refuge ceremony. And that is the demarcation line between someone who is or isn't Buddhist, whether they have gone for refuge. And when a person goes for refuge, they are then oftentimes bound by the five lay precepts. Not every teacher always gives the five lay precepts. Sometimes they'll only give the refuge vows. But in this class, we're approaching it from the perspective of a person holding the five lay precepts. So this is just sort of a quotation, because the five lay precepts are the foundation of the Buddha's teachings on ethics. And so this is, a quotation from a sutra where the Buddha is kind of explaining why ethics is the foundation of the path, because it is you could say that we can't really become someone who's benefiting, who wants to benefit others, if we're actively harming them. We have to start by restraining our overt actions, our actions of body, speech, and mind, that are overtly harmful to others, if we want to make progress in being able to be of benefit to them. If we're going out and we're killing and we're stealing and then we're coming home and we're meditating on love and compassion, that disconnect is huge, right? It's a problem. So we have to give up these harmful ways of relating to others in order to make spiritual progress, which is why the ethical teachings are the foundation of the path. Okay, so there's five of these ethical precepts. The first precept is do not kill. And here, killing refers to the intentional taking of the life of a sentient being. And it does refer, the vow itself does apply to humans and also non-human animals. From the Buddhist perspective, we may have said that there is a distinction made between the human realm and the animal realm. In Western biology, humans are animals because they're not plants, and that's fine. You can think of it in that way. But humans have a unique range of experiences that are different than what is happening in the animal realm. So from the Buddhist perspective, they do make a distinction. And but the vow does apply to all sentient beings. The Buddha intends for us to abstain from killing, intentionally taking the life of any sentient being. And a sentient being is a form that is connected to a mind. In Tibetan, it's Samchen, which literally means mind possessor. So, and I think maybe we mentioned, I'm not sure, that the test for a sentient being is if you observe that form and whether over a period of a day, a couple of days, that form has volitional or intentional movement. It goes from point A to point B without any change in the environment. But even very simple forms like flies and mosquitoes and ants and worms are sentient beings. So certainly insects, spiders, worms, they're all sentient beings from the Buddhist perspective. And we're exhorted to doing our best to avoid killing them. If and when we may intentionally take the life of a non-human animal, it damages the vow. Killing a human intentionally destroys the vow, which means we're no longer holding that vow in our mind. And there's the reason why there's this distinction. One is practical, because it's difficult to never take the life of a fly, a cockroach, a mosquito. Um, and it's much easier not to go around killing other people. Um, Also, as I mentioned, animals and humans have very different experiences. An animal cannot achieve enlightenment kind of under their own power in that lifetime, due to the power of prayer, perhaps, when they're dying, maybe they can take rebirth in a pure land or something. But that's really not their own effort. That's really due to the prayer of others, the power of prayer. But a human can train their mind, even over the course of just a single lifetime, and achieve enlightenment in that body. So they can meet the teachings for the very first time as a human, and before they die, they can fully achieve enlightenment. So in that sense, depriving a human being of their life is more harmful than depriving an animal of their life. But as I said, the vow applies to both. Any questions on the first precept? Do not kill. And this is, again, just a quotation from the Buddha, giving us that instruction. And this is another quotation talking about the advantages of abstaining from killing, and the benefits that sentient beings derive from us making that choice also. I'll just give you a moment to read it. All right. The second precept is do not steal. To steal, there is a specific definition from the Buddhist perspective, that when a person goes for refuge, they are agreeing. They may have thought about stealing differently prior in their life, but they're agreeing, from this point forward, I will think about stealing like this, which is to not take anything that has not been freely given. Really, of course, by someone who has valid authority to give it. So a person who isn't bound by this precept, they might see a $5 bill on the street. Maybe it's late at night. Maybe there's nobody around. They're the only one there. And they're going to pick it up and take it, because they're like, well, I know it's not mine, but I didn't see anybody drop it. The street is deserted. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. I might as well, take the $5 and, because otherwise it's just going to sit here. Maybe it'll get ripped up. It's not doing anybody any good. So maybe I'll just take it. That's stealing from the Buddhist perspective, because that $5 fell out of somebody's pocket and they didn't choose for us to receive it. They didn't make the decision that we should be the recipient of that $5. We could find a safe place for it, put a rock over it, and hope that somebody goes back for it. Just, in the same way that we've retraced our steps, right? When we've lost our car keys or our wallet or we're hoping that somebody did that, right? We're hoping that somebody took our $5 or our ID or credit card and found a safe place for it, and that when we retraced our steps, we could find it again. We should give other people that same consideration, is what the Buddha is saying. So anything that hasn't been freely given to us by the person who owns it, validly, legally, ethically, we just leave it alone, or we just safeguard it maybe in a way. So with this, we have to appropriate it and think of it as one's own. We might be in the process of taking it to a police station. If it's, a bag of gold or a bag of cash or something, maybe we take it to a police station. We're not thinking of it as one's own. We're thinking, I'm trying to reunite it with its owner. But as soon as we think of it as one's own and we think, I can spend it, or I can do something with it, or I can use it for my own benefit, at that moment, we've stolen it. So, yeah. And of course, with all of these, or most of these, we've got to use our wisdom, right? These are not edicts that we have to be skillful in how we are thinking about it. For example, a person, we might go out with a friend, they may have driven there, they may become intoxicated, we may think they're a danger to others, we may take their car keys, and we may drive them home, or if they become belligerent or something, they may leave, and we might take their car, and we're not necessarily thinking of it as my car forever and ever, but we don't really have the right in a way to use their car, but it is our goal to protect them from harm. It is our goal to protect other people from harm. And so we're taking possession of their vehicle, at least temporarily, in a way that, you might think, well, am I stealing this? It's not my car, but I'm certainly choosing to, I'm deciding where it goes. I'm deciding what to do with it. But we shouldn't say, well, the Buddha said not to steal, so therefore, even if something much, much worse is likely to happen, I should just let that happen. I should just, not do anything because I have this vow. We do have to use our wisdom and be skillful and think, if there's good reason to think that something really terrible is going to happen, then I have to be skillful in how I'm thinking about how I'm applying my ethical precepts. Yeah, and this is again just a definition. So we know that this is not ours. We know that this is someone else's, and we intentionally appropriate it as our own. Any questions about stealing? Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, Venerable, you're saying, for my own clarity, if I see something and I think, so I see $1 million on the street and I think, oh, that would be so beneficial if that were mine, but I don't take it, or I take it and bring it to the police station. Just the thought of thinking that would be beneficial if that were mine is stealing.
No, you have to appropriate, as it says here, appropriate the article for oneself. So if it becomes under your control, then it becomes stealing once you regard it as one's own, and think of it as something that you yourself can take advantage of or can do something with. So if you hold in your mind the clear understanding, this is not mine, this does not belong to me, but I'm going to engage in a path, a path of action that is intended to reunite it with its owner. I will not spend it. I will not use it for my own benefit in any way. I will simply try to do the right. I don't want somebody else to come along and take it or for something bad to happen to it. So I'm going to just let the authorities figure it out. That's not stealing. But if you're like, well, it's appropriate for me to actually make use of it, and then you do make use of it, or you don't even, you just start to go down that road, then it is the karma of stealing at that point. You could reverse course, you could change your mind, but in which case you've kind of switched gears. But yeah, as soon as you regard it and like think, yeah, I can do whatever I want with this, just for my own benefit.
So just again, nuance of clarifying this. So if, because I've known this to happen to people where they've found money and it's like, if it's not claimed within 7 days or 3 months or whatever, then you can keep it. So it hasn't been given by the owner, but the owner can be located. So you have the option of keeping it. Would it be, so it's not okay to keep, is what you're saying, if you have taken the refuge vows.
I guess what I would say is that the society that you're in has developed a legal framework. And so, as long as you have taken it to the authorities and you filled out the paperwork and, you gave them your name and your number, and then they're the ones that call you in a week and they tell you, well, we did everything we could, then really they legally, because it says here legally and blamelessly, um, you know, they're the ones who now have control, and they are choosing to give that control back to you. So I would say that you could decide maybe to give it to charity, or then you might just think, well, the best thing for me to do with this is not to kind of use it to just increase my own self-grasping, or so to do something really useful with it, not just like go out and buy a new car or something. But I would say it's okay as long as you did all of the right things, everything that you were expected to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that's stealing. So then the third precept is to not commit sexual misconduct. Sexual misconduct can be one of two things. It can be adultery or non-consensual sexual activity. So adultery doesn't depend upon a legal marriage in the Western concept. It refers to two people who are in a monogamous relationship. And you violate that expectation that exists, that was established and talked about and reasonable, agreed upon in that relationship. If you break that bond of monogamy that you've agreed to, whether it's a dating relationship or a marriage, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you've agreed to be bound by monogamy, and then you violate that expectation that you submitted yourself to. That's adultery. And if you know that someone else has made that agreement and you cause them to break it, you're also responsible. If you don't know, if they deceived you, they lied about it, they didn't tell you, then they, of course, probably they haven't taken, they're not holding this precept, but you do hold it in a way where you shouldn't cause another person to break it. If of course, you may be in a relationship and the relationship isn't going well, and you're thinking of ending that. So the idea is that you end that relationship, you free yourself from that bond before actually engaging in a intimate relationship with another person, or maybe you want to engage in a relationship with someone, they're in a relationship, you tell them, well, you've got to end it before I will entertain this, and then once it's ended, once that bond is not existent, then do whatever you want. It refers to the breaking of an expectation of monogamy. And then, of course, non-consensual sexual behavior is clear: sexual assault, rape, that sort of thing. Anything that is unwanted on the part of the other person would be sexual misconduct. So we're expected to restrain ourselves both from committing adultery or engaging in unwanted sexual behaviors. Are there any, is that clear? Any questions about sexual misconduct? Okay. The fourth precept is to not lie. So it says here, a lie is to say something that you know to be untrue to a sentient being who could understand you. So, you know, you speak English, they speak English. You know that you're saying something that's not true. You're attempting to be deceptive. You communicate that to them through words, through inaction, through, you know, in whatever way. You know, you communicate information to them, knowing that they're going to come to an understanding that is something that you yourself know to be false. Um, that is a lie. If you, you know, if they don't speak, you know, if they only speak French and you speak English, and you're trying to deceive them, and you know they can't really be deceived because they can't understand you, then technically it's not it's not actually lying at that point. That you do have to actually be actually communicating with them, you know, in a way that they can understand. But if your intent is to communicate that which you, and if you yourself are wrong, you think something is true and it just isn't true, that's also not lying. You know, you yourself believed something to be other than it actually is, then you're not lying in that case either. You yourself have to know that what you're communicating is false. And here again, this is another example where we have to be skillful. We may say something that isn't true if the goal is to protect someone's life or someone's property, or you know, if we know that one person intends to cause harm to another person, probably a good idea not to tell them where to find that person. Probably a good idea to be kind of deceptive because your goal is to prevent that person from coming into harm. So again, we shouldn't just say, well, no matter what the consequences of my actions are, I will always say what I know to be true. But generally speaking, and this is true with all of these, when we're motivated to engage in these actions, it's almost always a very selfish motivation. It's almost always something where we're trying to manipulate, we're trying to get what we want, we're trying to cause things to be, you know, to work out for how we would like it to work out. If that's not true, if it's a very selfless, very, you know, kind, loving, compassionate motivation, then, you know, that's not really what the Buddha is talking about. The Buddha is really saying that these are ways of recognizing afflicted states of that are arising in our mind when we wish to lie to someone, when we wish to steal from someone, when we wish to kill them, when we wish to lie to them. It's generally not a positive state of mind that's happening. So we can use that motivation, that action as a proxy, as a stand-in for a negative state of mind that's arising. And it's really that negative state of mind that the Buddha is concerned about. Any questions about the fourth precept? Okay, so we're almost done. So we'll just talk about the fifth precept and then we'll wrap up. So the fifth precept is to not take intoxicants. And an intoxicant is any substance that leads to what's called heedlessness, that doesn't have a medicinal purpose. So there are many mind-altering substances, painkillers and so on, where, you know, they do alter our perception, they alter our inhibition and so on. Like, you know, where it says don't operate heavy machinery, right? It's because, you're not in full control of your faculties. And that's kind of what heedlessness is. It's not being able to have clarity about what's happening around you. You're disinhibited. You you're not in control of your faculties. So we may have to take a substance that causes that, but if our goal is to recover from an illness, then it's okay. It's medicinal. It's fine. If our goal isn't medicinal, then it's an intoxicant, and then it's a problem, because not because the Buddha has, a problem with people having fun, but because when heedlessness is arising in our mind, we don't really know how to relate ethically, appropriately with the people that are around us. We've probably all consumed alcohol in our past, maybe our recent past for some, who knows. And it gets us into trouble. So where we say the wrong thing, we do the wrong thing, we harm people with our words, with our actions, because of this inability to moderate, to act appropriately, to respond compassionately, kindly, with wisdom to what's happening in our environment. And that's the danger of heedlessness, is that our responses to the people around us won't be appropriate. They will, there's many, many examples, millions of examples of people who would never hurt anyone, would never kill anyone, got super, intoxicated, and really awful things happened, would never commit sexual misconduct, and yet under the influence of alcohol, totally lost their ability to control their responses and engaged in horrible, horrible activities. So that can certainly happen, and lesser gradations of that are happening too, and it's a problem. And the Buddha is exhorting us not to put ourselves into that, not to let that happen. So the question becomes, is a single drink something that can lead to heedlessness? That's something that people have to decide for themselves, really. The vow is ideally to just completely avoid. I do think it's relevant also, if a person is taking it with a teacher, how does that teacher intend for the students to hold that vow? Is it really the teacher's, if the teacher's intent is really that they're taking it very, very, very seriously, and they're saying absolutely abstain, then by taking it from that teacher with that understanding, you're kind of agreeing with that. So it can be important to get a sense of how is the vow being given, what is the expectation, but the vow itself really does mean to just close that door, we just don't need to have recreational, substances that can get us into those trouble, that problem, all of those problematic things that can happen. And then to be mindful, if we are doing something that is medicinal, to kind of maybe reduce our socialization to, not to be mindful about that, and to know how it's going to affect us, and to take that into consideration. Okay, so those are the 5 lay precepts. And so this isn't everything. We'll look in more detail about other things that the Buddha also taught about ethics. But these are 5 things that it's reasonable for a person to say, I will never do again for the rest of my life. Not easy, difficult, but possible. There's other things that are more subtle that really we can't say, and that's why they're not precepts. The precepts are more overt actions. That is, it's at least reasonable to say, like, the Buddha's going to talk about, for example, raising your voice in anger towards someone, like, as something we shouldn't do. But that's too subtle for us to really take a vow that says, I will never raise my voice in anger. But killing, stealing, lying, sexual misconduct, intoxicants, these are things we can choose to close the door on. And, we'll probably make mistakes. Of course, we're human, we're ordinary, we're going to make mistakes. These are training precepts. We are training the mind. We are adopting these as an intentional training, and mistakes will happen. Hopefully not the very serious ones, but some mistakes, of course, will happen. And we do we need to recognize that and not be too uptight about that. Okay, so that's everything that I had for today. Are there any questions about the 5 lay precepts? All right. Well, I hope to see everybody back next week for class 3.
Thank you.
Of course.